Good evening. Tonight on the show, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison reveals his firm has had to leave Australia because of the anti-business climate. That exclusive interview coming up. Plus, Jennifer Westacott gives her response to being snubbed by the Royal Commission. Her only interview on the show tonight. And Japan's ambassador tells me the Albanese government wrote to them to explain the melon scandal. I'll bring you that story shortly. But first, when Albanese was campaigning to become Prime Minister in 2022, he kept hidden his plans for a big Australia. He didn't tell voters he was planning to massively increase migration. Yet under his government, net overseas migration increased to 538,000 people in 2022 to 23, 429,000 the next year, and 306,000 the year after that. And this shows little signs of slowing despite repeated promises. Well, in my exclusive interview with Markson tonight, the former Prime Minister tells me that Albanese basically lost control of immigration.
It's careering along and has for the last few years because they've just let it run loose. That's my observation. And as a result, the net overseas migration figure has hit, remarkable levels.
Well, there's an ideological reason behind Labor's push for a big Australia, but another reason too. Population growth has become a convenient way to make the Australian economy look stronger than it really is. I mean, we've been in a per capita recession for 9 of the past 16 quarters, but we never fell into a technical recession thanks to migration. As Matthew Cranston writes in The Australian today, increasing the population is a cheap trick in an attempt to boost lacklustre economic growth. And the Reserve Bank has controversially put that issue in flashing lights. Here's what RBA alluded to in their statement yesterday. Relative to the May forecast, a stronger population growth assumption has led to slightly higher GDP growth over most of the forecast period. And a journalist asked Michelle Bullock if she was concerned that immigration was the only thing lifting economic growth.
Are you concerned that the only thing that boosted your GDP revision was population?
Are we concerned? Yes, we're concerned because the productive capacity of the economy is not growing.
Well, this is the problem. The Albanese government is effectively importing population growth, but it's not making Australians any better off. And instead, it's been putting pressure on housing supply. And then in response to this, the Albanese government appears to have deliberately caused a housing market crunch. And shockingly, the Prime Minister seems proud of this. I mean, we heard his response in Question Time yesterday. Despite the fact that we are going to see families, particularly young buyers, go into negative equity and lose their homes. And today, another warning sign about this from CBA boss Matt Coman. Despite the CBA's obscene $11 billion profit, the Commonwealth Bank, which is the biggest home lender, said that mortgage applications are down 15% since the federal budget. Yes, since the budget, when the tax changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax were announced. And investor mortgage applications are down a massive 28%.
Affordability to interest rate rises, of course, global uncertainty, including the oil shock resulting from the Middle East. And yes, the tax changes that are announced, I think it's understandable that many people sort of took a step back from the market.
It's a similar story at Westpac, where home lending was down 20%. Now, the government just can't dismiss these official results as coalition spin or political talking points. There is, before our eyes, a devastating collapse in the property market, and the flow-on effects will be far-reaching. But then there's also this, the stunning hypocrisy of the fact that Anthony Albanese has become a self-made millionaire by using the housing tax breaks that he's now removed for younger Australians. And the opposition asked him, about this today.
Why is the Prime Minister attacking millions of aspirational Australians for trying to get ahead, just like he did?
Yesterday, as he will know from Hansard, I was quoting Scott Pape, the barefoot investor in the Herald Sun. Now, if the member wants to attack the Herald Sun for its coverage of housing issues, then that is a matter for him.
Not really an answer, of course, but that line of attack from the coalition will hurt the Prime Minister politically. The average Australian is worse off, with higher power bills, petrol prices, interest rates, and inflation still rising. While the Prime Minister has taken full advantage of every taxpayer-funded perk available to him over his 30-year parliamentary career, and now on a $622,000 salary with a chauffeur and grand mansions, quite frankly, he's lost touch. Now, I have to say I am genuinely sick of talking about melons. But I do want to talk about the hypocrisy of female Labor ministers. Because more and more Labor women appear to be foregoing their beloved cause of feminism to back in the Prime Minister's sexist joke. Today, Claire O'Neill was the latest to join her colleagues in defending the seemingly indefensible.
The Liberals have absolutely lost the plot here.
Japan is a very important strategic and economic partner. It was a very successful visit, and I think the former ambassador is wrong in his interpretation.
I know this Prime Minister. I work with him every day. I know how he relates to women. He has enormous respect for women.
Look, these very same women were outspoken when it came to so-called women's issues under former Prime Ministers Scott Morrison or Tony Abbott.
Can I tell you, Mr Deputy Speaker, the tragedy for Australian women today is if we started crying about the women we know who have been raped and murdered and sexually assaulted and sexually harassed, if we started crying for the women that we know that this had happened to, we would never stop.
Look, these are very important issues, but somehow that was a tirade directed against Scott Morrison. I mean, it was hard to understand that at the time, and harder now, how he could have possibly been personally responsible for any of that. And Claire O'Neill in March 2021 also spoke about Australian women demanding change, again blaming the then Prime Minister.
As an Australian woman, all I want is for the Prime Minister to show the leadership that's going to be necessary to resolve some of these issues. Ultimately, I'm still waiting for him to stand up and say, I lead an organisation which has a deep cultural problem and I'm going to try to take responsibility for that and fix it.
But now when it comes to their own leader, of course they're silent. And well, actually not silent, they're defending it, even when his hand actions have clearly been interpreted by many as mimicking breasts. And when there's a higher standard of behaviour expected of the Prime Minister. There are no women's groups coming out either, not even the group The Mad Witches, which shows that this women's movement during the Morrison era was driven by politics. But I do find it bizarre that Albanese refuses to apologise or make any admission. He seems to have an aversion to ever admitting he's wrong. I mean, it's what the New South Wales Premier Chris Minns does so well. He just admits when he's got it wrong. It allows him to quickly move on and the public like him even more. But instead of just apologising and moving on, Albanese's press team have been working the corridors of the press gallery in Canberra. But can you imagine what would happen if a male CEO, because that's exactly what our Prime Minister is, if a male CEO made the same comments with the same lewd hand gestures about a female CEO or a colleague? And that would be viewed as intolerable in a work setting, and that chief executive would be out of a job, even with an apology. Well, quite rightly, the coalition again today demanded Albanese apologise. They also called for an AFP investigation into the leaking of a diplomatic memo sent by Japan. Now, that memo raised the podcast that Albanese was on. I was interested in how the Albanese government responded to that memo, whether they apologised directly or gave Japan a reassurance. Now, the Japanese ambassador, Kazuhiro Suzuki, told me today, "We have been informed by the Australian side that Prime Minister Albanese did not make the comments in the way that has been reported." Now, this is very significant, and I'll tell you why. Because it suggests that Albanese, or the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, did move to reassure Japan that he didn't mean to cause any offence. The ambassador went on to say, "In any case, the dinner hosted by Prime Minister Albanese during the Prime Minister's visit to Australia this May was held in a very relaxed atmosphere, and we believe it helped build a personal trust relationship between the two leaders." Well, this is very dignified from the ambassador who represents Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. But Japan has made it clear that they know about the lewd podcast, and Australia had to send a diplomatic cable reassuring Japan that no ill offence was intended. Well, the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism is risking the credibility of its own findings over its decision to exclude prominent leaders like Josh Frydenberg, Dave Sharma, and, as I revealed last night, Jennifer Westacott. These are extraordinary admissions because of what they've each done in the fight against anti-Semitism. Their insight would be invaluable to Virginia Bell, and to not hear from them is an act of self-sabotage. University of Western Sydney Chancellor Jennifer Westacott put in a phenomenal submission to the Royal Commission. She had solutions in there, and she identified causes of the problem. And more than any other figure in the tertiary education system, she showed leadership in tackling anti-Semitism. And I'm delighted to say she joins me now here on the desk. Jennifer, welcome again.
Thanks
to
very
the
much.
program. Now, when you were told that you weren't going to be called, what was your reaction?
Well, look, it's not for people like me to tell the Commission who to call. I mean, this is a very important institution. It has a lot of authority and legitimacy. It's governed by people with tremendous legal expertise and integrity. But it was, for me, an opportunity, I think, to tell a different story about the university sector, where my university and other universities did take action against anti-Semitism, took a very strong moral position, at the same time as we did things in our university like assist students from Palestine with our fleeing conflict program, because our university stands for morality, moral consistency, the dignity of people, absolute zero tolerance to hate, to anti-Semitism, to racism of any kind. And it would have been good to tell that story. But hopefully my submission, which I put a lot of effort into and a lot of thought, will actually help inform the Commission's work. I was disappointed and distressed that Josh Frydenberg wasn't called, because this is a person like yourself who has really led on this issue, who's been the victim of anti-Semitism, who called for the Royal Commission, who's our most prominent political Jewish leader, but who's also got tremendous value to add. You know, he's got tremendous insight into how institutions work, how systems of government work. And in my submission, as you know, I talk about that we need systemic responses. Now, Mr. Frydenberg has that kind of expertise. And again, hopefully, his written submission, which is excellent, will help the Commission form its recommendations and its deliberations to government.
I mean, you used the words that you were distressed to see that Frydenberg wasn't called, but and you know, I understand you're a very humble person, but you must have been surprised, given your expertise, particularly in the tertiary education sector, that you weren't called.
Yeah, look, I as I said, look, I can't comment on the rationale or reasons. Yeah. And look, you know, I think that the Commission has got a very difficult job. They've had 20,000 submissions, and you know, I just hope that my written submission gets looked at very carefully, because I went to a lot of trouble to diagnose what I thought had happened, to talk about the university sector, but to also offer some broader recommendations about how we as a country get through this, and I guess my principal point that I was making is that this is not a failure of any one institution. This is a failure of collective leadership, of collective judgment, and the Commission must set a line in the sand and look across the institutions, the systems of how we lead this country, and make a series of recommendations so that we put anti-Semitism into the fringe of society where it belongs, that we eradicate it.
I think your submission was particularly powerful. I think it's one of the best I've read, I have to be honest, because one, it talks about your personal experience, which you've been on this program before to talk about, you know, how your father was in effect held to anti-Semitic views. But then you talk about what contributed to the anti-Semitism crisis. You say a failure of leadership, a failure of governments. They were too slow to act. You say it was also a failure of moral leadership. But then you identify the solutions. So I think that's what makes it such a brilliant submission. And I wonder if you think this is why you might not have been called, because you did criticise the failure of governments to act, including the federal government.
Well, I don't single out any institution. I single out our collective failure of leadership. And I think it's important that we all stand back and say, as a collective group of leaders, whether it was government, university sector, business to a lesser extent, but and in all these cases, people did act with exception. But across the board, we walked past those protests, and in walking past them and allowing them to get more and more severe in the nature of the anti-Semitism, to me it created almost like a acceptance that this was okay.
Became normalised.
Became normalised. It kind of, to me, creates
as
like
did the terror flags and the hate
exactly.
slogans.
To me, that creates, as I describe it, the antecedents for what happened at Bondi, which was horrific. And the other point I make, which I think is really important, is the importance of leaders to act with moral consistency and moral clarity. And I go to some lengths, as you know, in the submission to talk about this. And what I've seen over a long period of time, but particularly since October the 7th, is people, saying that they don't agree with racism here, but they accept it over here. And if you kind of walk past things, you sort of say, well, that's okay. Well, it's not. It's the same. And so, to me, you either believe in the dignity of human beings or you don't. You either believe in the dignity of all human beings or you don't. You either reject racism or you don't. You either reject the mistreatment of women or you don't. And you can't say, I accept it, I reject it here, but I accept it over there.
You talk about that specifically with the LGBTQI community as well.
Yeah, who are silent, and the Jewish community, and I'm obviously part of that community, and I've spent many years being an advocate for that community. And I always make the point that, number one, the Jewish community stood by that community, particularly in the marriage equality debate. But more importantly, and this is the really crucial thing, and I always, give speeches to the community on this. If you turn a blind eye to one form of hatred, you will unleash another one. And we've seen, that terrible treatment of young gay men by representatives of the Islamic community. That was really shocking to me, and that's my point. If you just say we're not going to talk about this hatred, this anti-Semitism, then by definition you start to legitimise other forms, and you might be at the end of it, And I've put up with a lot of, homophobic, awful remarks in my life, and I don't want to be part of a leadership cohort that legitimises any kind of hatred.
Absolutely not. I'm sorry to hear that. Do you still have confidence in the Royal Commission, or are you concerned that its findings won't be as thorough as they could be had they heard from, some more important voices, but not just important voices, had they called chancellors of other universities to ask them about their actions, for example?
Look, I do, because I think that the terms of reference are kind of, right on the money. And I think, the government did take advice on that from very important people. And I do think that, Commissioner Bell is a person of high integrity and obviously a very, very expert judge. So I do. I think the more important thing is that we get some very specific recommendations. So I've called for things like a national uplift in education. So I've agreed to co-chair a body that's going to work with employers to educate people across
Really
business.
great idea.
In anti-Semitism. But we need these things at a national scale.
Yeah.
So I hope they make recommendations, and this is my point, not for individual programs, but for systemic change. Because what we've now got in our society is a fracturing of our social cohesion.
Yeah.
And that requires systemic national change.
Yeah. Well, given you've been able to make it work at your university, I hope they do give you a national position. Jennifer, thank you so much again for your time.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Well, the Sydney Morning Herald has today reported that a far-right influencer who mixes with neo-Nazis has not only become a member of One Nation, but interviewed Pauline Hanson last month. This was Andre Mamet on the sidelines with Hanson at a Conservative conference in the UK.
What is the right going to do moving forward with the fact that Antifa gets away with so many attacks on people on the right? And if there's any mention of the right doing it, groups get banned, the government bans people and individuals. What can we do going forward if One Nation becomes government?
Look, it's happened for the last 30 years and I saw the attacks that I had on me. Grow a backbone and start saying, no, we're not going to cop this.
And she was even featured in this video he posted on his social media account. Yeah, and the 19-year-old has even posted a video criticising the move to ban the now outlawed National Socialist Network. Well, joining me to discuss former Victorian Liberal Party President Michael Kroger and News24 host Joe Hildebrand. Gentlemen, wonderful to see you.
Lovely to be here.
Michael, look, does Hanson need to improve her party's vetting processes?
Well, yes, I don't think, political leaders of any description should be interviewed by people like that. But does it affect her standing? No, because at the heart of One Nation is they are unconventional. They are outsiders. They make mistakes. They do things differently. They have rough edges. One of the reasons people are voting for them is they're not part of the political establishment that do everything by the book, because the public thinks, well, those sort of doing everything by the book, that's failed us badly. We need someone who can, rough the place up a bit, burn a few bridges. And so in it makes no difference to her standing, but, from the traditional spot that I sit in and that you and Joe sit in, we don't like anyone being interviewed by extremists or the left or the right, Sharri.
But Joe, I mean, if there are neo-Nazi supporters, this is a worry.
Bloody oath, it's a worry. And this is something I've been talking about and warning about for absolute years. There's obviously a huge number of just completely normal people with completely reasonable concerns who have gone over to One Nation in recent months. But there has also and has always been a really strong overlap. And it's not just a matter of vetting these people. There is a strong ideological overlap between a lot of what One Nation says or has sort of buried in its sort of fairly slim party manifesto, and what extreme groups, including neo-Nazis and white supremacists, really want to see. That is why this man has joined the party. This is why he is fanboying while interviewing her. And I've dealt with these people. I know you have as well, Sharri. One Nation, as Barnaby Joyce said, got its massive surge in support after the Bondi terror attack. These people are hardcore anti-Semites. These are people who are apologists for the worst anti-Semitism, the worst murder of Jews in all of human history, which has been a pretty sorry one since day dot. So the fact of the matter is there are really dodgy, bad people, and they are playing footsies with them.
Yeah. I want to turn, just linking the, One Nation issue. John Howard has told the Herald that the Liberals should resist the urge to strike an alliance with One Nation. He said the only party that we should ever be in coalition with is the National Party. If you want a good centre-right alternative to this miserable, rotten mob you've got now, then support a coalition that's working hard on policy alternatives. Michael, do you agree with him?
Well, of course. Of course John Howard's right. We're in coalition with the National Party, and we have been for decades in government. So, you know, for many reasons, you can't have a three-party coalition in government. For those people that want us to be in coalition with One Nation after the election, if the three parties together have a majority, what, a three-party coalition? That would be completely unworkable and wouldn't last long. No, our coalition partner is the National Party. If we need to rely on One Nation votes to get a majority in the lower house for legislation, for confidence supply after the election, well, that would be after the election.
But
There's no point speculating about it now because...
But what if they get more seats than you? Then what?
Well, I don't think that's going to happen. Irrespective of what the votes are, the Liberal Party has to basically come third in a lot of these electorates for One Nation to win. Because without Liberal preferences like Farah, One Nation are not going to get, unless One Nation on 42% primary voting seats, they're not going to win enough federal seats. They're not going to win 60 or anything like it at the federal election. So the Liberal Party and the National Party together, I'm confident, even though we're on a sub-20 number at the minute, by the time of the election, they're going to have a majority over One Nation at the election because One Nation can't get enough preferences to win seats like they did in Farah. But that won't be repeated in most parts of the country.
I mean, Joe, there's a lot of pressure on Angus Taylor to start looking at an alliance, given the combined Conservative vote is 50%.
Yeah, but I mean, Michael's completely correct. Just because that's what the overall national vote is coming up at in polls, that is very different to how it plays out in each individual seat. And it is very clear to me that if you are still voting for the Liberal or National Party or telling a pollster that you're going to, when One Nation is at its absolute peak, you are probably a never One Nationer. You are probably from the moderate wing of the Liberal Party and you would hold your nose and preference Labor over One Nation if you had to do that. And of course, notwithstanding the fact that One Nation has taken a lot of blue-collar Labor voters, which I'm very upset about. But you know, Labor votes are obviously going to overwhelmingly flow to the Liberal or National candidate over One Nation if Labor becomes the third party to be knocked out. So it simply doesn't work on a seat-by-seat basis. And also the Libs are doing pretty well in Victoria at the moment. And I think once people see that the coalition can win an election and that One Nation is not the boogie monster that just wipes it out, then maybe people will do what John Howard is saying. And again, of course he's right. He's always right. This man knows Middle Australia in his gut better than almost any Prime Minister in history. And so if he's telling you what it takes to win and where Australia will eventually land, pays to listen.
It does indeed. I just want to turn to the speech that one of the moderate Liberals you were just talking about, Andrew Bragg, gave at the Press Club today. Now, he slammed his own party's leadership for its demise. He championed multiculturalism. Michael, what do you think of his approach? I mean, do you think he's clearly gone out on his own, right? This is an official coalition policy position. Is this going to cause a headache for the Liberals?
Not much. I think Andrew's well known for speaking his mind, and quite frankly, good on him. He was absolutely right about the National Construction Code building code. What, 2,000 pages to build a house? I mean, that's a perfect example of why this country, it's one of the many reasons why this country is in a complete mess at the minute, when a builder needs to know 2,000 pages of legislation and rules before he can build a house. On immigration, he's putting a number out there. That's not coalition policy, and the number will come out in due course, and it'll be, I would presume, it'll be quite a significant amount less than that. He was critical of the leadership over recent years. He's probably right on that.
Yep.
I mean, we've just had the worst result we've ever had in an election, and the one before that wasn't much better. If he'd come in and he said we've never been going better, I would have criticised him. But Bragg is simply saying we've let the team down. And I think on that scale, Bragg is absolutely correct.
All right.
And good on him for saying it.
All right, there you go. He's got your endorsement. All right, we're out of time. Michael Kroger, Joe Hildebrand, great to see you both.
Thanks.
Still to come, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison reveals his firm has had to leave Australia because of the anti-business climate under Albanese. That exclusive interview after the break. Well, I caught up with former Prime Minister Scott Morrison for an exclusive interview about Australia's anti-business climate, the worrying economic outlook, how the Iran war will impact on Trump in the midterms, and how the Liberals should deal with the rise of One Nation. Here's our chat. Scott Morrison, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Now, you've written a fascinating column on the Iran war, and you start with this interesting point that this began over their nuclear program, but now it's being fought as well over the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, how does this conflict get resolved when, as you point out, there have already been 7 de-escalation announcements?
Not easily, and perhaps not at all. I think that's what's emerging. It has become a bit of a stalemate. And what is acutely in focus now is the impact that the Iranians' leverage over the Strait is doing to oil prices and how that's impacting, I would say, non-US economies more so than in the US itself, and particularly in Asia. And that is playing out. It's playing out on fuel prices, even in the US. And with midterms approaching, well, that has now become the focus of trying to get that waterway open. Now, what I suspect will continue to happen is what we've seen. I think we're going to keep seeing more of the same until either side is able to achieve a rather significant breakthrough in either getting the other to step back, or indeed one is able to compel the other, which is the approach the United States will ultimately, I suspect, have to take, and that is an escalation of the conflict.
President Trump made it very clear initially that he only saw this as a short war, but now it's expected to impact the midterms, and it's already impacted his standing in the polls. But ultimately, Iran can't just be allowed to control the Strait of Hormuz, can it?
No, it can't. And this is the rather difficult situation the president finds himself in. And you're right, the midterms, some months ago, the idea that the Senate majority was at risk, I don't think was a realistic threat. And it is now in play. And what's really changed for the president there is, yes, Iran has an impact, but it's the cost of living, just like it is here and in most Western democracies. And it's how this conflict plays in to that cost of living issue, and particularly at the pump price. Now, ironically, the economic impact on the pump price is not as great in the US as it is, say, here, or particularly in Asia. The US is a bit more insulated from that as a major producer of oil. But at the same time, this will still filter through, and this will mean that the president will keep trying, I think, to de-escalate what's happening around the Strait and get some of those supplies out, while at the same time keeping the pressure on the overall conflict and not giving away something that is absolutely fundamental.
Look, just showing how deadly serious this is and the great risk that the IRGC poses. There have been breaking news reports this afternoon that there was a credible threat that Iran planned to shoot down Air Force One with a surface-to-air missile with President Trump on board, and this led to his dramatic evacuation.
We're talking about an apocalyptic terrorist regime that doesn't play by anybody's rules other than their own, who has been calling for the death to America for 49 years. And so I don't think there's any great surprise that they would try to take out their president. They've not the first time. They've been trying to take out US presidents for years. I mean, there has to be a day of reckoning for Iran, and this president has been seeking to bring that. But it's a very difficult thing to do. And those who argue he's doing it for politics, well, I think the evidence says the opposite to that. He is doing it at great political cost. And I think that shows his genuineness about his stand on this issue.
On the economy, the big picture is that interest rates are rising. And Scott, you remember how Labor blamed that one interest rate rise on you. I mean, now how many have there been under their watch? Some 15. And of course, it's not their fault. Inflation remains high, well above the target of 2 to 3%. The housing market is now imploding as a result of Labor's tax policies. This sort of outlook, how worrying do you think this is?
Well, Australia, because of our history and where we sit, a AAA rated economy, all of this gives us some resilience to what is happening globally, but it's not a free pass. And our trim mean inflation figure is stubbornly sitting where it is above the target rate. And with the bank saying yesterday that they're not expecting to see that change until late next year, I think says to those on mortgages that don't expect a rate cut anytime soon. And if anything, they stand at the ready, I think, to put things up. Ironically, probably the only thing that's prevented them from doing that is the devastation wreaked on Australian property owners by what happened in the main budget. What is really driving inflation in Australia has really not a lot to do with gold, particularly the core inflation.
The RBA made the point yesterday that immigration is one of the only factors holding up our economic growth. Do you think there is a case to bring down this big Australia that Albanese brought in?
Well, it's careering along and has for the last few years because they've just let it run loose. That's my observation. And as a result, the net overseas migration figure has hit remarkable levels. Now, early on, you could say that there was some pent up demand following COVID when we literally shut the borders, and as a result, there was some catch up. But it's years and years since that now. And when you've got a net overseas migration rate, which is running well over 200,000, then you can expect these pressures. You can't force them to go and live as permanent migrants anywhere else in the rest of the country. We did quite a number of things to have temporary migration visas tied to being in particular parts of the country. But the government completely changed that definition and made that pretty much everywhere. So it blunted its effectiveness. But in Australia, I think, like in most Western democracies, migration plays an important role, but it has to do it behind strong borders, which are well policed and well enforced, which is what Operation Sovereign Borders was all about. And then you've got to have a migration program which runs to rules and is focused on one thing, your economy. And the other things we've seen, particularly in the most recent budget, sadly, these are the things that are really dampening the entrepreneurial spirit. I operate in the private sector now, and I see it myself. People are actively thinking about, if I'm going to start a business, should I be doing it here? Should I base myself in Singapore? Should I base myself in New Zealand? Should I base myself in the United States? I've been involved in a company myself which has had to do that in order to get ahead. So Australia starts with a lot of advantages, and those advantages are being eroded away.
When you just said that you were involved in a company yourself, do you mean that your company had to move offshore?
Yeah, we were doing things here, and our CEO and founder has gone over there. That's where the contracts are, and that's where. When you look at all the things that you have to do and the compliance issues and so on, it is just getting. One of the things that really, I've moved on and I'm no longer in politics, anything like that. So, but one of the things that it really I find hard to watch happening is what small business are really struggling under at the moment. We were able to get them through COVID. Whole, the vast majority of them. A day doesn't go past when, frankly, someone doesn't approach me and say, well, thanks for getting us through. And they are, a lot of those people are small business people.
Scott, how do you think the Liberal Party should combat the rise of One Nation, which is well ahead of it in the polls?
Well, One Nation, like most of the populist parties, do well when they capitalise on the dysfunction of the major parties. And that's where we've seen all around the world. And if you look at, I think, what's happened in the UK, you've seen Reform's position actually steadily declining now for many months. But it's interesting to see the steady rise that the Tories have had under Kemi Badenoch, where they have been consistent. They have been on the issue of the economy. They haven't focused on reform. They've focused on their own narrative on the government and on their own economic policies and their own positions. And I think there are a lot of lessons in that. And I think the UK could prove to be quite prophetic in terms of how we see this issue play out.
By the way, I didn't even ask you, are you well? How are you going?
I'm great, loving life. I just need my Sharks to win this weekend. We didn't have such a great outing on the weekend. We were going quite well. So I'm hoping to see a turnaround this weekend. I'm sure the boys will go well.
All right, well, good luck and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Sharri.
Good to have a chat with him. All right, still to come, ASIO has been given new powers to crack down on universities. Plus, with house prices falling in 38 marginal seats, how will this impact on the Albanese government? Julie and Lisa after the break. Welcome back. Universities will be forced to disclose dealings with institutions in hostile nations. Countries include China, Iran, Russia, Belarus, Vietnam and Laos. ASIO will also no longer notify universities when they're under investigation. And Shadow Education Minister Julian Leeser joins me now live from Canberra. Julian, thanks for your time. Great to see you. Now, you've actually criticised this for not being strong enough. Why?
Well, you know, you can't have a situation, Sharri, where after Iran, a criminal terrorist regime that has attacked Australia on 2 occasions, where we've booted the ambassador, where we've listed the IRGC, where we've said people can't travel there, you can't have a situation as we have presently where at least 2 universities are still dealing with Iran. And all they've got so far is a polite letter from the department to say, stop doing this, and the department covers up for which universities they are. I think we need to know which are the universities that are still dealing with Iran, and there needs to be some proper penalties through the mission compact process by which the government negotiates funding with universities. There needs to be penalties for people who are engaging with Iran if they've breached the autonomous sanctions regime, and the universities themselves need to bring penalties against any staff who've continued to engage with Iran and some of these other countries where there are real security concerns for having partnerships and arrangements with them. No wonder university reputations across the broader community are so poor when they can't even read the writing on the wall about our strategic adversaries.
And one of the reasons why this is concerning is if Australian intellectual property or research, especially when it could have a dual purpose, is sent to a hostile nation, we just don't know how that would be abused.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, there were reports of Australian researchers working on drone technology with Iran, drones that have been used in the Straits of Hormuz, drones that have been used and exported to the front between Ukraine and Russia, drones that could be used against Australians. That's not in our national interest, and our researchers and our universities should be serving our national interest.
Out of interest, do you know which universities are cooperating with these hostile nations?
I don't, Sharri, but like the rest of Australia, I'd love to find out.
Well, let's find out, Julian. Let's make that our mission. Look, I want to ask you about the fall in house prices. I've been speaking about it all week. A report in the Fin Review shows that house prices have dropped in 38 marginal seats. So looking at this from a political perspective, I mean, most of those are held by Labor currently, but also your seat of Barara. Do you think this will benefit Labor or the coalition?
Well, I'll tell you who it won't benefit, and that is families in my electorate. The Labor government has taken a baseball bat to the housing market here, and they have wiped $114,000 off the value of the average home in my electorate, and that is making everyone poorer. And at the same time, when I talk to real estate agents, they are not seeing any uptick in my electorate in terms of the number of new first home owners entering the market. So this policy of Labor's toxic taxes is just tanking the housing market, making Australians poorer and not achieving their aim of getting more first home buyers in there. It's a failed policy and it's a double whammy for people in my electorate.
Today, your colleague Andrew Bragg put forward the figure of 180,000 net arrivals. Is that official coalition policy? I mean, Pauline Hanson said we should have 130,000. 180 official coalition policy?
Well, let me explain how we're going to come to the figure. Firstly, the Labor Party has completely lost control of the migration program. They've brought 1 million people here and we have to reduce net overseas migration. I've been very clear about that, as has everyone. What we have said is that we will base the net overseas migration figure in any particular year based on the houses constructed the previous year. Now, if we were in government this year, Andrew Bragg was effectively giving a figure of 180,000 because that's based on the number of houses constructed in the previous year. But of course, the next election is not until 2028, and we would apply that policy setting to work out what the NOM would be based on the number of houses constructed in the previous year prior.
So you're saying 180,000 is how many migrants you'd bring in if the election was this year, but you can't tell us what it would be if you won at the next election?
Of course, we don't know what's going to happen to the housing market over the next couple of years, because there might be a growth in the housing market, in which case we'd bring more people. There might be a decline in the housing market, in which case we'd bring fewer people.
Don't people want to know? Don't people want to know what the coalition figure is, though?
What we can tell Australians very clearly is that we will base our figure based off the number of houses that are constructed the previous year, because you can't bring people to the country if you can't house them. And that's been the problem with what Labor has done. They've let the migration program get out of control. They've brought 1 million people here in 4 years and they just can't house people. And this is putting extraordinary pressure on the housing market.
The Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism is wrapping up its hearings at the end of the month. Do you think it's heard from enough people? Do you have any concerns?
Sharri, this was the Royal Commission that Anthony Albanese never wanted to have. He lied about it. He denied that he never wanted to have it. And he set the timetable to report by the end of the year. I frankly don't feel that the Royal Commission has heard from enough people. I think it needs to hear from the key university leaders who were there at the time some of this bad conduct took place. I think it needs to hear from many more of the arts organisations than it's heard from. I think it needs to hear from the protest organisers. They should be in the dock rather than asking the questions. I think it needs to hear from government ministers and it needs to hear from people like Josh Frydenberg. I think it will be a great tragedy if the Royal Commission wraps up at the end of the year without hearing from those groups of people at the very least.
Yeah, completely agree. Well said. I'd add some politicians in there as well. The Prime Minister, the Home Affairs Minister, the Foreign Minister.
Absolutely.
I could submit quite the list.
Education Minister.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Julian Leese, I really appreciate your time from Canberra. Thank you. Coming up, the photo that's shocked the world. A small boat with 230 people headed for the UK. Plus, Hunter Biden's weird as all sit down with Tucker Carlson. That's next. Well, an extraordinary image of the UK migration crisis emerged this week. A small boat packed with 230 people spotted crossing the English Channel, breaking the previous record of 165. For more on this, Spiked Online editor Tom Slater joins me from London. Tom, good to see you. So tell us about this image. Have you got us there, Tom? Okay, we're waiting to hear from Tom. In the meantime, I want to turn to this interview that Joe Biden, as in President Joe Biden's son Hunter, has done with far-right, I can say safely, anti-Semite Tucker Carlson. Look, it's peculiar that Hunter Biden has sat down with Tucker. He has. Have a look at this.
There's no possible way all of the information that was eventually labeled as my laptop came from one laptop. If it's anti-Semitic to point out that Bibi Netanyahu is evil incarnate, then you know what? I don't know what to say to people anymore.
Now, in that interview, and I haven't watched the whole thing because I had a very busy day, but what I have seen, Hunter Biden describes Candice as a good person. I mean, this is not a good person. She has gone after Erica Kirk, a widow. She's a full-blown anti-Semite, even worse than Tucker Carlson. Tom Slater's back with us, so let's bring him in. Tom, what do you make of this very weird pairing, very friendly pairing of Tucker and Hunter Biden?
Well, it seems like Tucker Carlson at this point will have anyone on his show, provided they can rant and rave about the Jewish state, indulge in a level of conspiracy theorising, regardless of who they are, what kind of untrustworthy character they might be, which at the very least you could say about Hunter Biden is that is the case. And to see the kind of indulging of Candace Owens, someone who alongside airing, shall we say, the world's oldest prejudice, is also a complete fruitcake, you know, is convinced that a combination, from what I can gather, of questionable forces, Jews and probably aliens were responsible for the murder of Charlie Kirk. But I think it just shows the sort of rabbit hole that Tucker Carlson and many of the people that he has on his show have fallen down. And yet he treats them with such reverence and such credulity in a way that he wouldn't if they just happened to be, say, a pro-Israel Republican who he subjects to a kind of level of grilling you would expect of some kind of war criminal. So, yeah, very curious phenomenon, the whole Tucker Carlson thing. But I certainly didn't see the Hunter Biden, Tucker Carlson love-in coming.
No, absolutely not. I mean, especially because back when Tucker was on Fox News, I mean, he had Miranda Devine on his program all the time to talk about her brilliant reporting and investigation into the Hunter Biden laptop. I mean, it's just utterly bizarre. I want to go back to that image of the that really symbolises the UK immigration crisis. Those poor people jammed on the boat. What's been the reaction?
I think it's utter shock. I mean, that's more people, Sharri, than you get on a Boeing 737. And this is a government that claims that it's smashing the gangs. Yes, the numbers overall are down, but I think what we're seeing here is just that the people smugglers are adapting. And given the fact there's been a string of stories this week in the press about illegal migrants, quote unquote, asylum seekers, committing some horrific crimes, we're just being reminded day by day that if you have a border that isn't controlled, there's going to be all manner of people who slip through, including those who mean harm to the country. So I think it's just a big, stark, flaming visual reminder of the fact that our borders are not being enforced and that the government is doing precious little about it. And for a long time, I think Labour hoped this issue would go away, but at the moment, the only thing that stops these boats is the weather, and the weather's been pretty good in the UK over the past few weeks, so it's only going to run and run.
Tom, you know what has completely floored me is that you just got a new Prime Minister. He was desperate for the top job, and then he goes off on holidays for a week. Why would he do that?
It's incredible. It's incredible. I think it just shows, despite, as a lot of Labour Prime Ministers like to do, they like to pretend to be really in touch and down to earth. He's totally clueless. He's totally misread the mood of the country. And the fact that while he was heading in one direction, thousands of migrants were heading in the other direction, I think it just underlines what a sour start it's got off to for Andy Burnham.
Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, if you really were desperate for the top job, if you wanted to be Prime Minister, you would start working immediately, not go off on a holiday. It's just extraordinary. Well, Tom Slater, sorry we had those technical issues. We'll have you on for longer next time. Thank you for joining us. And thanks for your company this evening. I'll see you tomorrow, as always, at 8 o'clock. And coming up right now from the Man Cave, the great Paul Murray.